Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. And for all those of you who've just joined us, a very warm welcome to the second Asia Business Responsibility Summit 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, our world is filled with outstanding stories. Stories of victory, stories of heroism. However, the greatest stories are those stories that others tell about you. Stories that become a benchmark for others to live by. And today, with the award ceremony, we take this opportunity to honor personalities who have been a source of inspiration for all. But of course, before we do begin with the award ceremony, we have a special milestone to share and launch today. And thus, for that, we'd like to request our esteemed dignitaries to please step up and take their seats on the dais. Yes, inviting our chief guest, Mr. Philip Armstrong, Senior Advisor on Corporate Governance and ESG Department, IFC, Washington, D.C. If I may please request Sir to kindly take his seat on the dais. He's also inviting Mr. M.K. Chauhan, Chairman, Mahindra and Young Knowledge Foundation, and Vice Chairman, Global Advisory Board, Asian Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability, to please come up on stage. He is also inviting Ms. Vladislava Raibota, Regional Corporate Governance Lead, IFC, Ms. Renuka Ramnath, Founder, Multiples Alternate Asset Management Private Limited, and Ms. Ranjana Kumar, Independent Director, Tata Beverages Limited. If I may please request all our dignitaries to please step up and take their seats on the dais. Could I please invite Ms. Ranjana Kumar, Independent Director, Tata Beverages Limited, also on stage. And in line with our mission to create a more sustainable environment, I'd like to request Mr. M.K. Chauhan to please present a green certificate to Ms. Vladislava Raibota.
For those of you who have come for the first time in the evening program, I'd like to share that we do not give flowers to our guests. We have begun to plant trees in their honor. It's a part of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP program, 1 billion trees to be planted. And 10 trees have been planted in honor of each one of them, whom this green certificate is being presented.
Welcome, ma'am. Is requesting Mr. Chauhan to please present a green certificate to Ms. Ranjana Kumar. Very warm welcome to you as well, ma'am. And before I request Mr. M.K. Chauhan to formally welcome the gathering and talk about the Women Directors Network, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce Sir to all those of you who've just joined us today. Mr. Chauhan is an elected member of Stakeholder Council of Global Reporting Initiative, Amsterdam. As Managing Director of a successful board advisory consulting company, he has the experience of sitting on several boards as an independent director from a variety of sectors like financial services, information technology, capital goods, telecommunications, etc., and has traveled extensively across the globe to deliver presentations and talks on corporate governance and sustainability issues. He is requesting Mr. M.K. Chauhan to please share his thoughts on Women Director Network. So.
Good evening. It's my extreme delight and pleasure to welcome all the eminent awardees this evening. But before we get on to the formal award presentation ceremony, there is yet another pleasant initiative that Asian Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability is undertaking, which is what is Women Director Network. Most of you might think that as a result of Companies Act 2013, which mandates the presence of one women director on the board, we thought of this initiative, but actually not. We have been believing in empowering women on board, and we believe that women bring in not only the gender diversity on the boards, but they also add to a lot of value-added discussions on the board. The whole dynamics of the discussions on the board changes with the inclusion of one or two women on the board, and why not? Because at least half the planet belongs to that gender. So we thought, and luckily for us, our partner, IFC, who has been so supportive of this, have been doing a lot of work in this area, so we thought we should have this opportunity and launch this. Let me tell you a little bit about this. First of all, I must place and record my grateful thanks to Mr. Phil Armstrong for kindly agreeing to release this. And Phil put a condition to me that I'm not going to speak on this. It is the Slava who will speak, because Slava is the architect of this whole joint project. Slava is in charge of IFC for this region. Thank you, Slava, for making this work. And what we are going to do under this is, let me first share with you what exactly the women directors who already are sitting on a couple of boards think about this issue of women on boards. Ideally, a board should have at least 2 women directors to have a quality discussion. That's what Zia Modi says. And Zia, as early as 2006, was the recipient of our Best Women Director Award. And I think, Phil, you will remember, Marvin and you both were there when Asian Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability had a joint conference in 2006, and we presented to Zia Modi the Best Women Director Award. We have Kalpana Morparia, who says, I truly believe that once these companies fulfill these mandatory requirements, they will start witnessing the merit of women directors on the board. This is Kalpana, recipient of our Best Women Director Award last year. And she happens to be a member of the jury this year. Rama Bijapurkar, I think voluntary affirmative action by boards saying they want at least 2 women directors with inclusion and excellence both as non-negotiable parameters will make all of us on boards try harder. Why 2 directors? Because we have to go beyond the tokenism of 1, which is mandated by the law, and there may be economies of scale in search. And Rama has been recipient of a Best Women Director Award as early as 2007. So what we did is that we must have a committee of mentors and advisors. And we went around to a couple of very experienced independent directors, and we are happy and lucky to share with you. Dilip Bhai, welcome, please have a seat on the head table here. Welcome to Mr. Dilip Shangvi. Thank you. So Mr. Subodh Bhargava is chairing this committee of mentors and advisors. Mr. Nasir Manji, in dual capacity, he is also a member of the Global Advisory Board of Asian Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability. Kalpana Morparia, Mr. M.K. Chauhan, that's undersigned myself, Rama Bijapurkar, Humayu Dhanrajgir, who is also a member of our Global Advisory Board. Humayu recently is there. I thought you said you were busy with the breach candy thing, so I was missing you, but thank you for coming, Humayu. And Narendra Mwani, the former managing director of Johnson & Johnson, and now he sits on Godrej and a couple of other boards. So these are the people who are a part of this committee. What are they going to do? They're going to get involved in selection procedure. We do want to encourage women directors on the board, but before we really take them on for mentoring or advising or training or orienting, we would like to have a panel discussion with these people and the most worthy of them who can contribute to the discussions on the board and the business issues and who can be a partner in the governance process would be the ones who would be invited for this. Criteria we try to put, and we are open to sort of fine tune it, and Phil, if you have any ideas, we would sort of, through your international experience, we would welcome women between 15 to 20 years of experience, because we feel by then they have had reasonably good idea about how businesses run and how governance process interplay between the management and board of directors happens. Should have been business unit head or either executive vice president of at least a mid-cap company, profit center head. For academicians also, we said a teaching experience of 15 to 20 years as visiting or full-time faculty. What's our commitment? And it's a ambitious one. Slava cautions me, but I must share with you, I am a little crazy guy. 14 years ago, when I co-founded Asian Center for Corporate Governance with several other Asian fellow evangelists, we launched it in India with the Director Power Breakfast meeting, launched 14 years ago in Mumbai. Some of the people came, some of them were little apprehensive and say, breakfast meeting in India, will it succeed? And in the very first inaugural meeting, I declared that we will run this initiative minimum for 10 years. And here we are on 14th year, and we have done 74 Director Power Breakfast meetings. Mr. Damodaran has been one of the early speakers at our Director Power Breakfast. Chandra has spoken, and many of you have come and spoken to. Homi Khusro Khan has spoken twice, once in Mumbai, once in Delhi. Humayun has spoken. So I believe that find the purpose means will follow. जब हम चले थे, हम थे अकेले. आगे बढ़ते गए, कारवां बनता गया. So we have to build a कारवां once again. For this initiative, Phil, for your interest, I want to translate it. When I began, I was alone. But I took the initiative and I went further ahead. Many people came and joined, and it became a कारवां. So that's the philosophy with which even Women Director Network we are launching. And this time we have a big brother, IFC, supporting us. So we are hopeful that this will go far. So we will train 150 women directors in 3 years' time, 50 each year. 2 programs, once in 6 months with 25, because more than 25 participants, if you take in a training program or orientation program, there are not enough interactions. So with this, we will train 115 in 3 years' time. And these women directors will be called again. The ones which are trained in the first year, exactly after 12 months, they will be brought back, and they will be sharing their experience as to how did this training help them, how did they contribute to the boards where they're sitting on the boards, and the other participants would learn from that experience. Obviously, such initiatives cannot run without the anchor organizations and supporting organizations. So we have IFC in partnership, and I must also share and thank that Tata Consultancy is one of our sponsoring organizations for this laudable initiative. Thank you, Chandra, for being so generous and helping. We obviously seek more help from other corporates who would like to help this, and we're trying to engage with Ministry of Corporate Affairs and see to it that if this initiative they consider laudable and a part of the women empowerment, and can it be a part of the CSR, I'm not so sure. But we will engage with them and see to it that as a project over a period of 3 years, if we train these kind of women, is this a women empowerment or not? So that's a thought. And now, ladies and gentlemen, launch of Asian Center, Women Director Network by Mr. Philip Armstrong. Phil, may I invite you, Slava, and Mem Kumar, all three of you, to kindly come over here, and Phil will just with the click of a button would release Women Director Network. Come, Phil. Yes. No, come close. Yeah, you have to.
That's the
What?
button.
Afterwards.
Know which button to click.
Yeah.
Which one must I
This
press?
one down there.
Okay. Do you
Down
have
there.
to count?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, could we please have a round of applause as we formally mark the launch of Women Directors Network.
Yeah.
We also have,
Yep. Please.
could I please request our dignitaries to also release the Women Director Network identity to make this launch an even more memorable one. And could I also please request our volunteers to distribute the corporate governance material from IFC to the audience seated here. And ladies and gentlemen, could we please have a round of applause? A slightly louder round of applause if I'm not being too pushy. Thank you very, very much, sirs and ma'am, for doing us the honors. And I'm sure in times to come, this will prove to be an accomplishment that we all are going to be proud of. Would now like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce Ms. Vladislava to all of us present here before I request her to share her take on Women Directors Network. She joined the Mumbai office of IFC as a senior corporate governance officer in October 2013 and has been with IFC since 1997 and has worked in a number of corporate governance advisory projects and has covered investment operations in Europe and Central Asia. As a regional corporate governance lead for South Asia, she serves as the main point of contact in the region for both CG investment support and all advisory services operations, including assistance to IFC investment clients. Yes, requesting Ms. Vladislava Rayabota, Regional Corporate Governance Lead IFC, to share IFC's perspective on Women Directors Network. Ma'am.
Thank you. I really appreciate my name to be pronounced right, because it's a very complicated name. I'm cautious of this. So thank you very much for inviting. Well, there are many different research saying that gender diversity in boardroom brings business benefits. And we are not talking only about financial performance or shareholders' value. We're also talking about increased employee and customer satisfaction. We also talk about improved and increased investor confidence, and also about increased market knowledge and reputation. And IFC is promoting gender diversity in boardrooms in many different ways. First, we promote when we invest. You might know that corporate governance assessment is an integral part of our investment process. So every time we invest in the company, we assess corporate governance. And as Phil showed you the methodology, the 5 components, one of the components is functioning of the board of directors. So if we see during the appraisal that the board is not diverse enough, in terms of gender, in terms of skills, we would advise the company, and sometimes not advise but require from the company to have this diversity. Also, we promote gender diversity through our corporate governance advisory projects. IFC has 2 arms, investment and advisory, and on advisory we're working with companies. So again, we recommend companies and we prove to companies that gender diversity is very important in the boardroom because it brings benefits. We also engage in a dialogue with regulators. We engage in dialogue with businesses and again promote diversity. We also practice what we preach. You might know that IFC sometimes nominates directors to investee companies' boards. And we have a global database of directors. And that's why I'm saying that this is a very challenging task, because we also struggle with this. We struggle with filling in our database with good candidates, female candidates. But nevertheless, we are trying to do this, and our own commitment of IFC is to nominate at least 30% of women in our boards. And also, we promote gender diversity through our partners. Asian Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability has been our long-term partner, and we really welcome this initiative. Again, I continue repeating this. This is a very challenging task because the company law requires women on boards. But this requirement is really difficult to achieve, especially here in India, in developing markets. Why? Because there is simply not enough good candidates. So we need networks like this, and we need networks which would provide very much needed training opportunities to women in leadership positions. And we also need to get them somewhere in one place, to organize them, and to provide for dialogue. So I really congratulate Mahendra with this initiative, and all I can do is wish you good luck. And also I have this...
Not me, to us.
To us, I wish good luck. And I have also a small secret idea that perhaps this network then will help us and supply us with good candidates to our database. So good luck to us, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And on that note, if I may please request Ms. Vladislava Raibota and Ms. Ranjana Kumar to please take their seat in the audience as we now move on to the next part of this session. Thank you very, very much for joining us on stage. And could I please request Mr. N. Chandrasekaran, CEO and Managing Director, TCS Limited, and Chairman of the Awards Committee and the Summit 2014, to please join our dignitaries on the dais. We now move on to our keynote address by our chief guest for today, Mr. Philip Armstrong. For those of you who've just joined us, would like to take a minute to introduce Sir to all of you present here. Mr. Philip Armstrong heads the Global Corporate Governance Forum based in Washington, D.C., United States. The forum is a multi-donor trust fund co-founded by the World Bank Group and the OECD to promote global, regional, and local initiatives to improve the institutional framework and practices of corporate governance in developing countries and emerging markets. Mr. Armstrong is an internationally acknowledged expert on corporate governance and was the principal convener and main editor of the 2002 King Report on Corporate Governance for South Africa. He has had a distinguished and varied career in executive and senior management in a number of South Africa's prominent listed companies, and today his keynote address shall be on global trends in corporate governance, links between economic development and corporate governance. Yes, requesting Mr. Philip Armstrong to please deliver his keynote address. Sir.
Afternoon keynote, right, sir?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, and for those who heard me this morning, I hope that I can keep your interest this afternoon. There are some aspects that I covered this morning that I may briefly refer to, but I don't propose to go through the same points again. I was particularly taken by the conversation in the last panel discussion around the new Company Act here in India, and some observations which I would like to come back to. And fortunately, in anticipation of the conversation, I was not surprised to hear some of the points, and perhaps I'll be happy to share with you some thoughts on that. I'm going to just very briefly run through a bit of background on what's taking place globally. I mean, India is certainly trying to keep up with that without a question. The real issue is the approach and the application, and it's far be it for me to say what should happen, but I can at least just share some observations from my perspective of, from experiences in other markets, how some of these things do work well, and sometimes how the unintended consequences tend to take over what was a well-intended idea. I think the key issue, as was discussed this morning and always seems to continue to be, is how do we make our boards more effective? And I'll just talk briefly on some of the points there. And then the issue of the financial crisis has really heightened the issue of risk. And there's a very sharp attention to risk, particularly in the banking sector, not surprisingly, given the financial crisis in North America and Europe. But I think it's really now, like a lot of this regulation, tending to spread out into the industrial and real economy. And therefore, some of the concepts that were thought through in the banking system have to be in some ways recalibrated, perhaps, to how they might apply in an industrial operation. We spoke a lot about sustainability this morning, and I'll just simply allude to that and then leave you with some concluding remarks. The one thing that I think has been obvious from a lot of these crises is that the boards that have sort of collapsed have not necessarily been made up of people who you might think on the face of it are poorly qualified to be directors. In fact, in some boards, they have comprised very highly qualified people. So one of the issues I think that continues to bedevil us or challenge us is how we are able to use a number of very sensible and eminently qualified individuals to produce what is a collectively sensible decision. And that continues to be a challenge, as we've seen. I think one of the challenges, as I mentioned this morning, is this proliferation of standards and the exercise by boards increasingly as to, well, which one applies or which part of it applies, how do we make this work for us? On the governance side, as I said earlier, things tend to be a little bit more straightforward in terms of how you want to structure your board, although I've seen boards do some very strange things even with that. On the other hand, if you're wanting to take your corporate responsibility to a new level, to a level that makes it in line with internationally regarded practices, you have to make a lot of choices in terms of the amazing amount of standards that are around you, the challenges you have from customers, suppliers, various consumers, and particularly civil society organizations, let alone the standard setters and the regulators and the policy makers who make those standards and rules. And I think the current Companies Act contains some elements of that. A lot of the times I talk about corporate governance, I try to remind us where we started with in the journey of corporate governance when it really came to the fore in the 1990s and resulted in the promulgation of what was then the first issue of the OECD corporate governance principles, which are now currently going through their third review and will probably be issued sometime next year. But fundamentally, corporate governance, at least in my view, was really designed to try and provide practical guidance around the minimum requirements that your law set. It wasn't really conceived originally as a regulatory instrument. If you talk to some of the early architects like Sir Adrian Cadbury, they're quite disturbed and alarmed about where corporate governance has taken us. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But fundamentally, at least the way I see corporate governance, is you have a legal system and sets of rules that really govern, if you're in the banking sector, some of the prudential provisions that the regulator wants to ensure to protect depositors and the financial system, for example. Or in the business sector generally, is what sort of are considered acceptable practices in your particular market. And so the sort of things as a company law would prescribe that you should have a board, and the board should be chaired by a chairman. What corporate governance then would seek to do is to say, well, in this market, whichever market it might be, this is what we would consider to be a properly constructed board. This is what we would consider to be the role of the chairman. But that would have to be modified and structured relative to the different types of industry, because a board in a bank is going to probably operate differently to a board in the chemical sector, or indeed a board that is of a state-owned company, for example. So the idea of governance was to create some flexibility, but to set rules that were accompanied by disclosure. And the benefit of the disclosure was that the market would then validate and test it. The regulator would play a discrete role in setting the disclosure requirements and the standards around which they wanted disclosed, or the practices. And then the market, be it the investors, be it the media, be it other intermediaries, would validate and test whether that company's disclosure, one, had integrity, and two, whether the justifications it was giving for following or not following the corporate governance was consistent with their understanding of the business and the personalities running it. So it wasn't, the fundamental issue around corporate governance, at least from my perspective, was more about trying to create the necessary conditions to try and encourage certain behaviors, rather than where we really find ourselves now with very prescriptive rules and guidance, which unfortunately leads to more of a box-ticking approach. I mean, that's not unique to India, that's common around the world. At least one thing we have seen, and we've done a few studies in the IFC, and what we have found, particularly in the Latin America, where we have a group of some 18 companies which are called the Latin American Company Circle. And it was interesting, this comprises family-owned businesses to professionally managed businesses, but these are companies that are noted for their corporate governance across the Latin American region. Predominantly, and not surprisingly, a good number of them are Brazilian companies, but there are companies from Argentina, from Chile, from Colombia, and elsewhere. But what was interesting was during the recent financial crisis, their stock market performance relative to their peer group was considerably or markedly better in terms of their performance, which to us was an assurance that at least in crisis, governance definitely supported the systems and the basis on which the market evaluated you as a company and as a board. The real challenge for the regulator, of course, is how do you get this to work properly? And this is really where a lot of the governance work continues to be in terms of the current developments in governance, because the underlying principle of governance is ensuring that there's a timely and accurate disclosure on all material matters regarding the corporation or company. And the key issue and challenge for many companies is declaring more than what you need to be, what you're required to disclose by regulation. In other words, how transparent should you go, and what benefits do you derive from that level of transparency? I think and the challenge continues to be this balance between how much do you leave to the companies to disclose in the so-called comply or explain approach, which is the sort of UK approach, which has really been imitated in many markets around the world. Or on the other hand, do you want something that's very rigid and draconian, such as the US rules and regulations? I think the global financial crisis tended to question both methods, and that really leaves the regulators with a significant quandary. And that's where I find the developments with the Indian Companies Act in terms of that quite interesting, because the sort of questions I often ask regulators when I'm with them is, one is, what is the mischief you're trying to prevent? What is it that worries you that you're trying to fix? The second question tends to be is, whatever your solution might be, can you regulate it? Can you enforce it? Can you enforce it consistently, or are you going to create rules that still work for the companies that were going to do it anyway, but the companies that weren't going to do it are still going to arbitrage the enforcement gap because they know that the chance of getting caught is unlikely or very limited? And that is the one issue. So a lot of the challenge I often face with the people I work with is trying to get regulators in some markets to be modest in what they're trying to accomplish so that you can build a culture of adherence to good practices rather than creating very sophisticated rules which are almost, companies are in breach on the day of its inception, and then you create this culture of impunity. And then the third thing is, what's the behavior change you're trying to create? So I guess when one looks at the laws and regulations, such as here, the New Companies Act here in India, is really looking at those questions and their enforceability and the capability in which the regulator is imposing on themselves in terms of introducing these rules. And I was involved a little bit with the inquiry into Enron, mainly because they wanted to understand the emerging markets perspective. And I always remember this quote at the time, which came from James Cornu at the time, who said, "You can't prosecute your way to a healthy corporate culture." It's really about how do you create the conditions that encourage behavioral change. And that is really the sort of things that one has to think about. Corporate governance can maybe guarantee compliance, but it doesn't necessarily derive the behavioral changes. And I think that's where one has to look at. So, for example, it's one thing requiring that every board should have one woman on, or certain categories of board, but is that still right? I mean, the question the board's going to have to ask themselves, do we need one woman director, or do we need more than one woman director, regardless of what the law requires? And these are sort of discussions that are taking place in a number of the other markets as well. And then the question is, how does that support the business? I mean, I'll be honest with you, I've been in some companies where the board selection process has been more than curious. And, when you've got a board that, in one example I have, and I have many, many examples, and I won't bore you with them all, was a business that was in the fashion industry, primarily with women's wear, but there was only one woman on the board who really was involved, who would have understood the conversation. The other were 9 men, discussing what the latest women's fashion should be and how that should be sort of defined within their strategy. Now, that's probably a bit of an extreme example, but the point I'm getting at is that while these laws are brought in with good intent, that I don't doubt, one as a board director has to really think carefully about, is that sufficient? And if we have to put on one director, let's at least make sure that that director is somebody who is going to have the credentials to support the strategy and operations of this business in terms of areas that we may be deficient on, in terms of the skills that we have on the board. So it's really about thinking through the process. Having said all of that, there's a wave of global corporate governance reforms around the world, and quite frankly, at times it's quite difficult to keep up. If I look at my emails that I get every day, the amount of new reports and new studies and new things coming through is almost to the point where it's difficult. And I remember one corporate secretary telling me of a FTSE 100 company in London, saying the amount of requests they get every week of surveys they have to complete, of studies that they're asked to submit to one or other NGO, it gets to a point where do you reply to them all, or do you reply to none at all? And either way, it doesn't really necessarily do your public relations a lot of good. But perhaps some of the key ones that are coming out has been the Walker Review in the UK, which really again zeroed in on the point that around the issue of behaviour, that the rules were there, the systems were there, but the behaviours weren't. And the challenge, as Walker presented to the regulators, is how do we fix that? I think if we had the answer, we wouldn't be having the governance crises we continue to see. So it's not an easy question to answer. You've got the Global Reporting Initiative now issuing its Due for Sustainability Guidelines, which it now wants to take a step further and start setting standards around that. You've got this proliferation now of stewardship codes. This is this effort to enforce or to try and oblige institutional investors to vote and to use their votes in a conscious way. But what are you starting to see even in the United Kingdom, where this was conceived, is that investors are voting because they have to vote. But are they thinking about their vote? There's some discussion around whether that's being exercised consciously. The other one is the anti-bribery laws, particularly because of their extraterritorial implications, and Petrobras in Brazil will recognize that right now in terms of the fact that, yes, it's a Brazilian registered company, partly state-owned, but has run into some difficulties in Brazil around issues of corruption and bribery that have drawn the attention of the US authorities because of its listing in New York Stock Exchange. So there's a lot of different dimensions that as a board member you really have to think through. That really brings me to the issue of boards and how do we make them better. And I guess a lot of the focus globally now is really around an area which I think we haven't always given a lot of attention to, and that's the effectiveness of our board committees. We often, when we talk about boards, we think about the structure of the board, but we don't often enough, at least in my view, think about the role of how do we populate the audit and the remuneration and numerous other committees that we either should have or recommended to have, or in terms of the new Indian Companies Act, must have. So the issue is, when you select a board member, it's no longer just finding someone who can fill a space on the board. It's about what role will they also play on the board committee. Do they have the time to play that role? And to what extent, and what other obligations or responsibilities do they have outside of serving on our board? There remains, however, this global push for independent board members. The issue, of course, is what do we mean by independent? And as one gentleman pointed out just before lunch, you can't legislate independence. It's really in the mind. It comes back to the behavioral issue and the conditions which you center around the structure of independence, particularly for board committees to have access to independent professional advice, to support them in their work, and then at the same time to have a budget which they can utilize, so that if they do need that independent advice, they have the funds at their disposal within the company budget to be able to hire that advice, to advise them, for example, on a tricky remuneration issue or a difficult issue around an audit issue that's come up in the audit committee. The other area that's become center of a lot of discussion is board evaluations. The problem with board evaluations, of course, is that there's no really common standard. Is an evaluation of one company, can that be compared to another company? If it has been done by different evaluators, and do they follow the similar standards? So at the moment, I think board evaluations, at least in my view, is something that you as a board want to do. You want to do it because you want to see, are there shortcomings in this board, either around our composition, around the way information flows within our board, or around the participation of some of our board members, or concerns with management or some other issues. So to me, having the board evaluation and having it mandated in some law or regulation is one thing. There's no yet clear agreement on what is a good board evaluation. The real issue is whether you as a board see value in that, and whether you see value in having an independent third party, or whether you have a strong enough and objective enough chairman who you feel and trust can run this thing internally, at least for the first few occasions, until people get used to this idea and decide perhaps to bring in an independent party, to bring in a more rigorous approach once board members are comfortable with the process. The other discussion which we've already had is the issue of gender on boards. It's either being mandated in law, as we're seeing here in India or Norway, France and various other countries such as South Africa, or being recommended in corporate governance codes. But then, of course, we're seeing this push for stewardship codes. And I guess the issue around stewardship codes is my earlier point about corporate governance. The concept of a corporate governance code being really effective, particularly the so-called Comply or Explain code, was that investors in particular had the wherewithal and the means to be able to analyze and assess and evaluate companies in a way which could test whether their governance disclosures as required by the regulator were in fact consistent and had the integrity with which they were expected to have, and then to engage in or enter into a constructive engagement at that point. Another area that's attracting a lot of attention is the role of the corporate secretary. While the role of the corporate secretary is quite common in countries that have a sort of a British heritage in terms of law, company law, such as India and Malaysia, South Africa and Australia, in many markets, particularly in Eastern Europe and Latin America, this is still a novel concept. And there's not very much practical or professional guidance. But that's certainly something that you're finding increasingly appearing in corporate governance codes and standards and rules in a lot of markets where the role of the corporate secretary has not been something that is well known or even understood fully. But the real issue is the corporate secretary being more than a scribe, being more than somebody who just comes to the meeting and takes minutes, to being someone who's an active participant in the board and keeping it well briefed, well inducted, well informed on governance issues and the way it takes its decisions and thinks about its decisions, working closely with the board chairman or chairperson and the CEO. That really brings me then to very briefly the issue around the financial crisis and risk. There's any number of new standards being issued. There's one just recently by the Financial Reporting Council in the UK. The OECD has come in on this. Basel, of course, not given the banking sector crisis, has issued a comprehensive updated guidelines. And the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a coalition of international investors representing some $18 trillion, of which I'm a board member, has just issued a comprehensively revised set of standards. But all of them are providing very elaborate provisions around risk. And the real issues around risk is thinking about what it means to your business. Not just we have to produce something on risk and we better, as long as we discharge that, everything's good, but to think of risk as something that's integral to your business, to your strategic thinking, and to your operational execution. And to avoid, as we call it, the trap of false precision. In other words, ensuring that you do have a risk process that really supports your business and understands not just the immediate obvious financial risk, but some of the broader operational risks that can catch you unawares. That, of course, then talks directly into the role of the internal audit, that the role of the internal auditor is seen increasingly as somebody or a function that is essentially advisory as much as it is compliance-driven or assurance-driven, that it's somebody who not just looks at whatever should be done is being done and being done properly, but is there improvements that should be taking place in the business? Are there notable gaps in the business that should be enhanced? And to bring that to management's attention in a forum such as the Audit Committee. Which then brings you to the whole role of compliance. This diagram here I could probably spend a good morning talking about. But the issue is ensuring that you have a framework that ensures that your governance mechanism supports your risk and that the compliance processes that encompass that are able to enable essentially an approach where decisions can be made comfortably, but particularly by the board, that relying on the information it receives. Because one of the challenges at least non-executive directors face, or independent directors, is the quality of the information they receive and the extent, because their decisions they make are only ever going to be as good as the information they receive. And that's probably where board evaluation becomes an interesting concept in generating a conversation around whether that issue is an issue at all and how do we address it as a board, hopefully with the active support of a progressive chairman. But as you can see, compliance is an expensive process. In the US, for example, compliance with the Dodd-Frank rules has been estimated to be somewhere around $21.8 billion. That's a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time for companies in the US. That brings me then to the issue of ethics. There was a lot of discussion this morning, just before lunch, around the issue of ethics, which was very interesting to me, because it's an area that you don't hear a lot of discussion around, certainly in some of the markets I operate in. But certainly one of the key focuses is around the issue of whistleblowing, or increasingly a term called speak out procedures, which has sort of become the new buzzword. But the issue around whistleblowing is how to make it effective. And it's not about, and how to make it constructive, and then how to ensure that it addresses, particularly in multinational companies, to cultural sensitivities in the many different jurisdictions in which they operate. But the fundamental issue around ethics is its execution. This is not an issue that applies only to staff or even to staff and management. It also applies to the board. It's about the board walking the talk. To avoid the Enron example, where exemptions were given to the board of directors on issues that constituted conflicts of interest, but were harshly and severely enforced with management and staff. And that's something I see in many organizations around the world. But I think the issue is how to get your ethics code actively engaged and understood right throughout the organization, on a basis of people know what sort of behavior is expected of them in a constructively guided way. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. The other reason why ethics has become increasingly relevant is because of its close intersection with the company's own objectives around corporate social responsibility, and needless to say, the social media. Because one of the things that we have to understand, and boards tend to learn the hard way, like JP Morgan a short while ago, is that social media is so prevalent now that if there's something going on in the company that someone wants to let people know about, you just need one disgruntled employee and all hell will break loose in your organization. So I think the issue is really around ethics, is to really understand how it works in your organization, what values you want in your organization. It doesn't matter in which country, region, or sort of cultural ethic you come from. The question is really how this works in your company, and it's a particular challenge for multinational companies as they look at this issue in much more comprehensive detail. Really bringing to a close, because I covered this morning, is the environmental and social and governance agenda. I mean, I think the initiatives continue unabated and are extensive and comprehensive at the same time. And the issue is really trying to work out where you want to position yourself in this, whether it's on issues of human rights and corruption with the UN Global Compact, or whether it's issues around, if you're in the finance sector, around insurance and the United Nations Environment Programme, or whether you're looking at something like the Global Reporting Initiative and a host of other organizations. But the challenge here is really trying to work out where to position yourself as a board, because these things are continue to proliferate. And the challenge is, although you have initiatives such as integrated reporting, the challenge around integrated reporting is it's still a very nascent and very early stage concept of trying to harness all these different requirements into something that companies can grapple with as one consistent approach that has some symmetry to it in being able to make decisions that are strategic to your business and its operational success. Just perhaps in concluding, the thing that I always remember, I remember asking a very prominent and very experienced board director just how he thinks about things as an independent director. And as he said, the day of the gifted amateur is over. The day that someone could just come to a board meeting from time to time, participate in the discussions, and then move away, actively participating, not to suggest that they weren't taking their job seriously, and really leaving it to the next board meeting has changed. It's something that requires constant vigilance and attention. And for that reason, it's an issue about continuing education, ensuring that as a board director, there are provisions and circumstances in your company where you can be updated on the business, on the industry, on new market developments, but importantly, what all these new legislations and regulations around you mean to you as an independent director and mean to you as a board member of the company in which you serve. And probably the strong part of it, again, comes through as the issue of ethics and public responsibility, recognizing that your reputation affects your colleagues on the board, and that the board Clearly, its reputation affects the company, and as I've seen in some markets, sometimes the reputation of the company impairs that of the country as well. It's just tends to be the way people look at these things and think about these things. But I think being an independent director in this new environment, given these proliferation of standards and rules that seem to come out with increasing frequency, it's a challenging task and a challenging demand. But perhaps on that note, I can end my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, sir, for briefly encapsulating the global trends in corporate governance.